1 Corinthians chapter 16, beginning in verse 13. I'm reading from the New Revised Standard Version. Keep alert. Stand firm in your faith. Be courageous. Be strong. Let all that you do be done in love. We're going to be dealing today with two words. The first word is the word fickle. It means that the loyalties shift. There's just no stability to a fickle person. Their emotions and their desires and their loyalties are constantly shifting. And you've noticed, if you've been with us through this series in 1 Corinthians, that the Corinthian church was a fickle church. It was an emotional church. They loved spontaneity. They were following their own spirits and their own muses, but they were fickle. They were easily blown about by every wind of doctrine, by every deceitful and well-spoken word. They were just not a firm and strong church. And that's why Paul is trying to talk to them here about how they might avoid in the future the perils of their past. Fickle. For Paul, the heart of Corinthians is that the church should be rooted in love, but the problem with using that word in English is that love is a fickle term in English. In English, love is used equally about salsa and about people, but it's not that way in the Bible. The Bible was not written in English. God called the Jewish people to follow him. The Old Testament is written in Hebrew. The New Testament, because of the nature of the Roman Empire, was written in Greek, but Jesus probably spoke in Aramaic. These are other languages from other times, right? And the word here, love, is agape in Greek. And the Hebrew word for love is hesed. And hesed is as far from fickle as you can be. Hesed is loyalty, steadfastness. There's a sense in Corinth that they didn't quite understand what the whole Jesus thing was supposed to be all about. And so they had just kind of thought it was similar to their pagan religious festivals, the way that a lot of Christians walk into a room like this and think that it's really just about a performance of something, like a concert you might go to. Fickleness has invaded our understanding of church, and it had invaded the Corinthians' understanding of church. It most played itself out in their loyalty to each other. They were only as loyal to each other as they were kind to each other. That fickleness has plagued this church, and Paul is trying to root them someplace else. He's trying to say, first of all, you need to be a people of hesed, of loyalty, of unyielding devotion to God and to each other. And then you have to understand how that hesed is supposed to operate in protecting the church from the corruption of wickedness. We're going to talk about that today. So this is the verse that I think is the heart of Paul's exhortations in the whole book of Corinthians. I think you could memorize this verse and you would have Corinthians summarized, but you need to get the details down. Now, in the New Revised Standard Version, it says, let all that you do be done in love. But remember, it's first written in Greek, and that's probably what it means. It's a good English translation, but I like the kind of the raw Greek. This is what it actually says, the literal Greek. All y'all... There's a lot of plurals there. All y'all in love be born. All y'all in chesed be born. Christians have no fickleness in them if they really have understood Jesus. Corinthians has been a letter intended in part to remind the churches of Corinth that though they receive the gospel very easily, that continuing in the gospel is not easy. It takes an enormous amount of work. For Paul, it requires some character traits that don't seem to be very present in this congregation. They have a lot of gifts. They can speak in tongue. They can do healing. But they don't have some of the character traits necessary to go the long haul with God. These are three that I've identified from these verses. Paul insists that in order to continue in the faith that was delivered to us, we have to be a people of readiness, a people of resolve, and a people of resoluteness. We're going to start with readiness. This is just the first verse there in verse 13, the very beginning of it. I think the NRSV says, keep alert. But the Greek more literally says, stay awake. Wake up. Keep awake. More or less, Paul is saying to the people of the church, you've fallen asleep at your posts. The fact that you're fighting with each other about who's the better Christian indicates that you've fallen asleep at your post. Jesus needs a different kind of devotion from the people who follow him. It's not about just saying okay to the words. It's about really learning what it means to be attentive to the things that matter to Jesus. In fact, I think Paul gets his language from Jesus when he says, keep awake. Matthew 26:36-41. Then Jesus went with them to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, sit here while I go over there and pray. He took with him Peter and 2 sons of Zebedee and began to be grieved and agitated. Then he said to them, I'm deeply grieved, even to death. Remain here. And here's the exact same phrase Paul uses in Greek, and stay awake with me. And going a little farther, he threw himself on the ground and prayed, my Father, if it's possible, let this cup pass from me. Yet not what I want, but what you want. Then he came to the disciples and found them sleeping, and he said to Peter, so could you not stay awake with me 1 hour? Stay awake and pray that you may not come into the time of trial. The spirit is indeed willing, but the flesh is weak. The enemy of what God is doing in the world is crafty. We often think that we're to stand guard and keep us people safe from what's outside of the church. But the danger, Paul indicates to the Corinthians, is not outside, it's within. And those who want to be attentive, the way that Jesus asked, need to be people of prayer and people of discernment, watching what's happening in the church, not standing outside the church and guarding its properties. This is the kind of alertness that Jesus requires, and too many churches hire someone to do that for them while they all go to sleep. Keep awake. That's what the Corinthians were doing. Paul will keep us safe. Apollos will keep us safe. Cephas will keep us safe. We can just float along. And Paul says your church is falling apart not because of Paul or because of Apollos or because of Cephas or because of Jesus, but because of you. The enemy's crafty. Faithfulness takes discipline and attentiveness, both within ourselves and within our community. We must guard the doctrines and behaviors of the church carefully. 1 Corinthians 16:13 says, stand firm in your faith, be courageous, be strong. What it actually says in the Greek is a little more aggressive. It says, stand in the faith, be like men, be strong. It has everything to do with the Hebrew word emunah. Emunah is the word used of Moses' arms. Some of you remember the story that as long as he kept his hands in the air, the Israelites were winning a battle, but when those arms fell down, they began to lose. And so he needed 2 people from the Israelites to hold his arms up so that they could do it, because he didn't have the strength to hold them up. And as long as his arms were emunah, they won. It's faithfulness, steadfast. The bravery of which Paul is asking is the bravery of one who stands against impossible odds. What Paul wants to say is we need some of that fortitude that you see on the front lines. We need some of that fortitude that you see when people are confronting physical evil or protecting the innocent. We need some of that fortitude in the church. Who's here for the church? Who's on their knees fighting like a spiritual warrior? Who's standing against bad doctrine? Who's standing against the wickedness that's in us, that's corrupting our own children? Who's going to war against that? Because that's the war God is fighting. He's fighting the war of character that takes fortitude to see through. We need resolve. And finally, we need resoluteness. I wanted ours, but it's hesed we're talking about. All y'all in love be born. All y'all in hesed. Hesed is a covenant and a military term in the Old Testament. It's the kind of loyalty that brothers in arms have with one another. It's the kind of loyalty David had with Jonathan, that they knew if times got tough, they would never betray each other. It's knowing that someone has your back. It's knowing that if someone tells you they'll be there, that they will be there. We need hesed. This is the way the church is structured according to Paul in another letter that has a lot of similar themes to 1 Corinthians. This is in Ephesians. It says this: the gifts he gave God gave to the church were that some would be apostles, those are the writers of the New Testament. Some would be prophets, those are the writers of the Old Testament. Some would be evangelists, those are missionaries who go spreading that message into new territories. Some would be pastors, those are the ones who shepherd the flock of God in a location, like I have been here. And teachers, some of you are these who teach. God gave all those things to the church. That's how he's with you. And what's their purpose? Well, Paul tells us right here, to equip the saints for the work of ministry, for building up the body of Christ, until all of us come to the unity of the faith and of the knowledge of the Son of God, to maturity, to the measure of the full stature of Christ. That's why these people are here. That's why God calls people to serve in these positions. And if they do their job well, here's what Paul says. We the church, must no longer be children, tossed to and fro and blown about by every wind of doctrine, by people's trickery, by their craftiness and deceitful scheming. But speaking the truth in love, we must grow up in every way into him who is the head, into Christ, from whom the whole body, joined and knit together by every ligament with which it is equipped, as each part is working properly, promotes the body's growth in building itself up in hesed, loyalty. There are reasons to leave churches. Paul has listed what they are. Bad doctrine, crafty people who trick, deceitful scheming, ministries that do not build up the body and encourage Christ-like living. Those are all good reasons. But where those aren't there, is there any out? No, it's hesed after hesed. Paul says, be there. Be awake. Be steadfast. Be courageous. Be strong. And my goodness, have some hesed. We're in a war. And God is fighting a war for hearts and minds. And it's a war that must shape us into a people of character who do not need law to restrain our wickedness. We need to be people who can be trusted. Do you do what you say? Will you be faithful to your commitments? And will you protect the church of God?